Thank you for tuning in to CITR 101.9 FM.
You're listening to Democracy Watch, the News Collective's weekly hour-long news report, bringing you alternative and undercovered current affairs coverage from Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. I'm Ryan Patrick Jones.
And I'm Alex DeBoer. It's Thursday, March 7th at 5:03 p.m. We are broadcasting from UBC's Point Grey campus on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. Today, as I'm sure you know, is International Women's Day. CITR has been playing Fresh FemCon all day, and in honor of this occasion, Democracy Watch will be starting off the hour with a feature by News Collective comrade Stephanie Wood. Stephanie attended local feminist journal Room's Literary Festival, Growing Room Festival last weekend. While there, she interviewed festival attendees and nationally acclaimed writers Selena Bone and Celine Knight. We then turned to a short report on Vancouver's rally that took place in response to the heightened bombing and humanitarian crisis in eastern Ghouta, Syria.
After that, Democracy Watch hones in on housing. We have an exclusive interview with Provincial Housing Minister Selena Robinson, and then a live interview response with Vancouver Tenants Union Steering Committee member Sydney Ball. It's going to be very exciting. During both interviews, our guests dissect the 2018 provincial budget and how it will affect renters. But first, we'll be bringing you headlines from Vancouver and the Lower Mainland.
And we have the latest development in the BC-Alberta dispute over the future of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. The past few weeks have seen some contention between BC Premier John Horgan and Alberta Premier Rachel Notley. In late January, Horgan stated that they would limit shipments of bitumen while they studied the risk of oil spills in BC coasts. Notley called this illegal and placed a ban on BC wine in retaliation, as we all know. Horgan then backed off his threat and referred the constitutionality questions to the courts. Earlier today, Alberta Premier Rachel Notley took aim at BC, threatening to cut off its oil supply if BC took any, and I quote, illegal actions. Notley noted that BC has relatively high gas prices, and so the Lower Mainland is susceptible to supply changes, and so this move would affect BC greatly.
This whole story just throws me off. I cannot believe that there are such high trade barriers between provinces.
Indeed, and it's interesting how trade wars are also looming on the international scale.
That's true. But turning to our next headline, all 59 BC school districts now have anti-bullying policies aimed at protecting students from being harassed based on their gender identity or sexual orientation. So these are codes of conduct or other anti-bullying policies that are specific to and inclusive of LGBTQ, two-spirit, and trans people. So the source of this was the province's education minister, Rob Fleming. He said that all school districts are in compliance as of January 2018. He also met with a group of trans youth on Tuesday morning to discuss their experiences as well as some possible reforms to the province's sexual orientation and gender identity policies. So this isn't actually the first deadline. The original deadline for implementing these policies was January 2017, but an investigation by the newspaper or the digital publication Extra a year ago found 6 districts had not followed through. But as of right now, those districts are now in compliance.
Great. So, next headline, Kim Campbell, the first and only female Prime Minister of Canada, was in Surrey today as a guest speaker for Surrey's Women in Business Awards, also related to International Women's Day. She recently drew criticism for calling out women on television for wearing sleeveless dresses, tweeting, quote, "Bare arms undermine credibility and gravitas." It's interesting, I was reading about this today, and she credits this to a study that was done saying that just people in general, regardless of their gender, show vulnerability when their skin is physically showing. And so she denies that this is a sexist comment, as a side note. So Vancouver has approved a new women's-only temporary modular housing unit at 525 Powell Street. The city hopes to have the building completed by May. Meanwhile, the provincial government purchased a plot of land in Maple Ridge to build more temporary modular housing on for a large group of homeless campers near Anita Place, which has been reported by the CBC. One camper said, and I quote, they're basically going to open up another government-run facility that's basically for people who are prisoners or crazy. We're neither in the case. So a little bit of controversy there over that temporary housing.
Yeah, on a similar note, I also read in the CBC recently that a couple of the people who were supposed to be moving into the modular housing development in Marpole have basically denied their spot, or they said they don't want to move in because of the hostility they've been receiving from protesters in the area.
Totally.
That's actually something Democracy Watch covered about a couple months ago, and so it's interesting to see. I mean, it's unfortunate that those people have felt so threatened or so unwelcome that they literally decided to give up what might be their only place to live at the moment.
Yeah, and I read in the paper too that a group that developed in reaction to the Marpole Students for Modular Housing, the founder of whom you interviewed in that story we reported a couple months ago, the counter group is actually taking the city to court over their process of consultation with the community. So that's an ongoing story.
Yeah, again, so I mean, if you listen to that story, it did seem that there was a lack of consultation with the community members, but I don't think that's the main reason that they're motivated. Anyway, moving on. The overdose crisis continues in British Columbia. So 125 people have died from illicit drug overdoses in January 2018. That's a 25% increase from December, but a 12% decrease from last January. So as we know, the numbers are fluctuating, but this does show that we're very much still in the middle of the crisis. Half of the people who died in January were between the ages of 19 and 39, and 82% were men. And still, no deaths were reported at supervised injection sites. So I wonder what we can do to help the process or help this crisis.
It's really unclear. All right, so those were the headlines from Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. We're just going to take a very quick break, and we'll be back with more Democracy Watch in a minute.
When you join Balloon Club, we guarantee that you will be able to make a balloon poodle within the first day.
Here at the UBC Ant Club, we just like to talk about ants and compare ant farms. It's really cool.
Paperclip Club is all about, well, paperclips mostly.
At Blah Club, you can blah blah, blah 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 blah. Explosion. There's only one club worth joining at UBC, and that's CITR 101.9 FM. We got free tickets to shows, whirly pops, professional help in all types of audio engineering, passes to festivals, crazy parties, live band swag, all types of crazy people. Our programming manager rides a motorcycle. There's freestyle rapping, Nardwar the Human Serviette, the vinyl and record libraries, Discorder magazine, free studio recording, and it sure beats the hell out of Paperclip Club, which is a thing that I just made up because I work at CITR. So come check us out on the floor of the Student Union building. We got all types of crazy shit for you to do, or check us out online at www.citr.ca.
Do you like the sound of your own voice? Are you a student that has a lot to say about the University of British Columbia?
If so, there is a place for you.
The UBC Affairs Collective is a brand new collective at CITR 101.9 FM that brings students together to cover campus news, including research developments, arts and culture, live discussions, and lots more.
The collective produces a weekly radio show, the UBC Happy Hour, that airs every Friday from 5 to 6 p.m. You can find all the episodes podcasted online at citr.ca.
Send an email to ubcaffairs@citr.ca if you'd like to get involved. No prior radio experience is necessary.
And we're back. This is Democracy Watch on CITR 101.9 FM. You just heard headlines from Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. In honor of International Women's Day, Democracy Watch put together a feature on a literary magazine festival called Growing Room Festival. News Collective member Stephanie Wood interviewed nationally acclaimed writers Selena Bone and Celine Knight about what it means to write from experience as women of color. Take a listen.
My name is Stephanie Wood. I'm a graduate student of journalism at the University of British Columbia and a member of CITR's News Collective. This past weekend, I attended the Growing Room Festival hosted by Room, a Vancouver-based feminist literary magazine. Room showcases writing and art by cisgender and transgender women, transgender men, and two-spirit and non-binary people. The panelists were all intelligent and successful writers. They were poets, activists, and novelists. They talked about a wide range of topics like white versus intersectional feminism, sexuality, the environment, and mother-daughter relationships.
I admire the work Room does so much. So to be recognized by their collective was pretty darn amazing.
I talked about these issues with Selena Bowen, a poet who was a panelist at the festival. She was shortlisted for CBC's Poetry Prize in 2016 and won the Gold National Magazine Award for Poetry in 2017. Bowen also won Room's 2018 Emerging Writer Award.
Sometimes I feel a little shy, like receiving these kinds of things, but also very grateful. Yeah.
And then what's it like being part of these kind of events and kind of conversations like within Growing Room?
It's been amazing. I have gone to so many great panels. I went to an amazing panel yesterday, led by Mallory Tater, with Casey and Samantha Knock and Amber Dawn, and it was a panel about the body, and it was just it was really incredible. It was so inspiring. On the conversation side, I always feel a little awkward being up here, like talking on a panel, but I'm so grateful to be given like the space to speak.
For me, as an interracial Indigenous female writer, it was inspirational to hear the Indigenous panelists speaking to experiences I related to, like the conflict between having both settler and Indigenous roots, trying to reconnect to that sense of place and trying to speak to that honestly through creative work.
My poetry right now is sort of tentatively tracking a language learning pursuit that I have to learn the Cree language. And in the panel, I sort of position myself, so I'll just say I am my birth father's family I didn't grow up with, but my grandmother is from Waterhen First Nation and my grandfather is from Flying Dust First Nation originally. And so on my birth father's side, there's Cree and a little bit of French, and then on my mother's side, it's all settler. And I was raised in a settler community, so I think I spoke about this a little bit, but I had romanticized the idea of learning a language, and in fact, the reality is it's like extremely hard, it's messy, it takes, daily dedication, and just recently have I sort of really started to try and sit down for an hour a day and learn, but I'm working towards creating a language learning group because obviously you can't learn language in a bubble and it's meant to be spoken and shared, and so I'm hoping to find other people who are interested in learning with me. So if you want to learn with me, hit me up.
And then there's one poem by Marilyn Dumont that when you were talking about, I kind of thought about when you said you incorporated Cree words into your work sometimes. And it's called Circle the Wagon, and she kind of talks about feeling the pressure almost to tick boxes as an Indigenous writer, like including symbolism like the circle and such in her writing. And she feels like there's this kind of expectation, but also you do want to include like your culture and everything. And so I was wondering if you've ever felt that kind of expectation.
Oh my gosh, totally. I think like not growing up in my community, I have also been I'm critical of my own sort of romanticizing, like romanticizing the idea of like learning a language and all of these things. And I think like moving through sort of my learning with that critical lens is really important. And deconstructing, the ideas of what does it mean to be urban and Indigenous is important. There are so many, amazing people whose work you should read. Like truly, like read Samantha Knock, read Billy Ray Belcourt, read Jessica Johns, like read Carly Baker, like the list goes on. And Marilyn Dumont is again one of those wonderful writers who has really paved the way and like lifted up a lot of writers as she's gone along. Has made a space.
And then for the future, once again, you spoke about it a bit, but some plans for your future work.
So I'm working on I'm at UBC right now working on my MFA in creative writing. So I'm working on a thesis that will hopefully be done by the end of the summer. I've taken way too long on it. I'm very slow. So I'm hoping that will come together in book form eventually. And then beyond that, I don't really know. I've been thinking like, oh, maybe I should try writing, like a sci-fi novel. That would be fun. But yeah, beyond that, we'll see.
I also spoke with Shalene Knight, the managing editor of Room and the director of the festival. Her book, Dear Current Occupant, just came out this month. It's just describe the amount of work you and the other members of Room have had to put into putting Growing Room together.
Yeah, well, it's a lot of work, and it's like a year's worth of planning. But I think one of the key things to recognize and understand is that this is not our full-time job. So I work at the library Monday to Friday, single parent, I have a kid, I'm writing, my book just came out, and everyone on the collective also has outside stuff. And so we try to do this in our spare time, which I know sounds absolutely crazy. But in doing that too, it feels so good to see it come together and to hear people's feedback around that. But there's also always things that we miss, or things that get miscommunicated, or that don't come out the way we'd like them to. And that's just kind of, the nature of putting together a festival in your spare time. And so, yeah, a ton of work, lots and lots of work.
What's an example, of something that you missed or kind of wished that you could accomplish in the future?
Right. Really sometimes it's just the small things, I'm not only responsible for programming, I'm also responsible for the accounting and organizing and author correspondence and contacting the publishers. So one small thing was we sent the checks for this venue to the other venue. So now the authors won't get paid today unless they want to walk over there and pick it up. So it's things like that where you wish they'd be a little bit smoother, but there's always little hiccups and bumps along the way, but still pulled it off nonetheless. Right?
You did. After going to a few of the events, it's very clear it's really important to Room that this festival be accessible in all sorts of ways. Maybe just speak a little bit to that, how important accessibility is.
Right. Accessibility is super important. And so not just, the physical accessibility, but also the financial accessibility. So all of the events are by donation, pay what you can, pay nothing if you can't pay anything, and same with the workshops. So we put it out there that if folks can't afford to take a workshop, to email me personally, and we'll just put them on the list, and they can bypass the whole put your credit card in thing. So, yeah, so we struggled a bit last year with accessibility, and we had a venue that had 1.5 flights of stairs, and that was very troublesome for a lot of our attendees. So we said, next year we're going to make sure we do not have that issue. And so this venue here has an elevator, which is fantastic. But, you can't do it all, and you can't please everybody. And there's always, at least one person that's going to be offended by a decision that you made or an author that you didn't include. But we just we take that feedback and we sift through it, and we do better next year.
But the general feedback, I'm sure, is it mostly positive from the panelists and the guests?
Definitely, mostly positive. And I think too, when thinking about the themes that we're talking about, it's really difficult to not say everything that you want to say, but the feedback and just the general feeling of all the rooms is really incredible. I'll be running to a different venue, and I'll run into an attendee who's like, oh my God, that last panel was incredible, and this one's happening, and it's there's this energy, in the buildings, outside the buildings, on the panels, and it's really, really wonderful. A lot of tough conversations, but very important ones too.
And then Growing Room seems, to be the main goal is to create a space for all these amazing feminist writers to be able to share their work and have these conversations. Is there anything else that you guys are trying to do with Growing Room?
Yeah, I think every year it's going to be bigger and better, and not in terms of more authors, but just in terms of the discussions. And I really like the idea of mentorship. And so this year was the first year that we introduced the manuscript consult. So having a writer sit across from an established editor or writer and talking one-on-one with them about their work is incredible. So I think just doing that, we've already kind of gone above and beyond what other festivals are doing, and paying all of our authors. We had a very, very small honorarium last year, and our main goal was how the hell can we pay folks more? So we really worked on that this year.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add about the festival?
just that I appreciate everyone that comes out and volunteers. Like, that's absolutely incredible to sit, in a hot room for hours, just, giving your time and space and energy to this. And it's like, we can't do this on our own. And I think it's really beautiful that folks take an interest and want to help. So I am very grateful and thankful to everybody who put this together.
I finished both interviews by asking the easiest and hardest question that you can ask a writer. Why do you write?
Oh my God, because I wouldn't know what to do any otherwise, or I'd just be this quiet girl saying nothing if I didn't write. That's pretty much the way I get all of my stuff out. Yeah, I have to. I absolutely have to.
Yeah, I'll harken it back to the idea of imagining alternative possibilities, creating space. I feel like it's one of those torturous things where a lot of writers will say, like, oh my gosh, like, writing is hard work. But it's kind of this feeling of like having to do it. Like, I get like so anxious and if I'm not writing. So yeah, I guess that answers the question. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
All right. That was a piece reported by News Collective member Steph Woods on Room Literary Festival, which took place last weekend. I really love how Steph draws from her own experience as an interracial Indigenous woman to inform her questions, and the kind of conversation back and forth is really intimate and honest. So it's one of the things I love about the piece. Just want to mention that. Also, Steph was telling me about the festival, and she did talk as well in this piece about the accessibility efforts it makes to be physically and emotionally accessible to attendees. And one of the cool things she was mentioning is that with events, if there are people lined up and they might not have room for everyone, they prioritize women of color entering. And so stuff like that that's I think just sort of starting to become more common. And I also just wanted to mention that I have been mispronouncing Shalene's name. I pronounced it Selena, and it was Shalene Knight. So I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
All right, and we now turn to a short piece reported on and produced by Comrade Rematullah Sheikh. This is an international story of catastrophe and horror in eastern Ghouta, Syria, with roots in the local. Rematullah reports from a rally held in downtown Vancouver in response to escalated attacks in Ghouta. It's been in the international headlines, lots of terrible death and destruction. And he speaks with Syrian Canadians and with who have family trapped in Syria. So take a listen.
Say it loud, say it clear, save Ghouta right here. Say it loud, say it clear, save Ghouta right here.
This was supposed to be a silent vigil outside the Vancouver Art Gallery for Eastern Ghouta, a suburb in Syria controlled by rebel groups. And an escalation in government airstrikes and a crippling siege have resulted in over 500 deaths in a span of just 8 days. The United Nations estimates that 400,000 civilians are trapped with little access to food and medical supplies. Soon, people raising awareness at the busy square in Vancouver realized they had to raise their voice. Riyam Al-Safasi, a medical aid volunteer with an NGO in Vancouver, explained what's going on in Eastern Ghouta, a place the UN chief recently described as hell on earth.
The Russian and the Syrian airstrike has targeted 12 hospitals. 4 of those hospitals has been completely destroyed. 2 are temporary out of service, which puts a lot of pressure, and the doctors inside Syria in Ghouta are telling us we cannot cope anymore. The amount of death, casualty has exceeded the 300 casualties. Including 1,600 injured. It's a catastrophe by all means.
The catastrophe has been especially hard on children. UNICEF released a blank statement to send a bleak message that no words would do justice to the children killed and the families that are suffering.
In war, the children are the first to suffer and the last to heal. So unfortunately, this systematic genocide happening in Syria is targeting anyone, and children are a part of this to terrorize them and scare them to accept status quo and not let them to smell or live in a free Syria. Children, they don't have baby milk powder. They don't have even clean water. So they need immediate aid convoy to go in and stop this massacre.
Save now, save here! Save Syria right here!
At the vigil, voices calling for freedom and an end to the siege clashed with the constant noise of a food truck selling shawarmas, a popular snack in the Middle East and Levant region, including Syria. There were some who were witnessing the violence of Eastern Ghouta through friends, families and relatives directly affected by the siege. We met Ibrahim at the vigil. Before coming to Canada 2 years ago, he lived in Damascus and Ghouta. He cannot comprehend the cycle of violence that has gripped an area he once called home. Our correspondent Samia Al-Juwaidi translated our interaction.
عندي معارف وأصدقاء وعندي أهل وقرايب موجودين حاليا بالغوطة.
Yes, I have connections there. Friends, families and relatives who are in Ghouta. They are suffering from shortage of medicines and food. They are suffering from bombings and the war that is happening inside of Ghouta. The war is monstrous. It's indescribable. Neither the media nor any field of politics can describe what is happening inside of Syria. You can say humanity has ended in the world. Imagine that 400 deaths occurred in 48 hours inside eastern Ghouta. They were all children, women, seniors. There is not even one armed man amongst them. Then who was the war on? Is it on the Syrian civilians or on the armed people? Who was it on?
على المسلحين ولا على مين الحرب؟ اللي بده يطالب بحرب واللي بده يعمل حرب واللي بده يطالب بأي شيء.
Both Ibrahim and Riyam al-Safathi blamed the Syrian and Russian governments for the misery in eastern Ghouta. But candles were lit, posters were spread out and chants were sung in chorus not only for the international community to take note. They also had a message for an audience not far from the art gallery.
Vancouver is the only city in Canada that has the honorable, and unfortunately they say honorable, Consulate General of Syria in this city, and the Canadian government can do nothing to stop it. Imagine a lawyer of human rights representing the Assad brutal regime in whole Canada, in the city of Vancouver. We have been trying several times to talk to her, Sausan Habal, even with the help of RCMP, where we have the open dialogue and we ensure it's in English to make sure that everybody is aware of what's going on. She refused to write any letter condemning the killing of children in Syria, period. A person who cannot condemn or at least take a stance against the brutality, I cannot be in this country or cannot represent Syrian in this country.
All right. That was a piece by our News Collective member, Rahmatullah Sheikh, on the current situation in eastern Ghouta, Syria, and a vigil that was held outside the Vancouver Art Gallery in response to the crisis happening there. We are now turning to housing. With the recent release of the 2018 provincial budget, Democracy Watch took some time to examine how this budget will affect Vancouver's housing crisis, and more specifically, how it will affect renters in the Lower Mainland. We decided to ask the province's housing minister, Selena Robinson, some tough questions on the immediate effects of her party's 30-point housing plan. This interview that you're about to hear took place on Tuesday and was conducted by myself and News Collective member Stephanie Wood. Take a listen, and then we will turn to a live response from Vancouver Tenants Union Steering Committee member Sydney Ball. We wanted to first of all start with you giving a brief explanation of the key elements of the 2018 provincial budget's comprehensive housing plan.
First of all, I think it's important to provide context. We're in the middle of a housing crisis. It's one that has been allowed to progress and to develop over the past, I would say, decade or so. When I became a city councillor back in 2008, it was already, I believe it was starting. We certainly were seeing homelessness. We were seeing people struggling already. And I would make the case that over the last number of years it's reached significant proportions, and our government's response has been that we ought to have a plan to address this housing crisis that the old government refused to actually do, because the crisis is hurting people, it's hurting businesses, and it's really hurting communities. And we know that solving this crisis won't be easy, and it won't happen quickly because it's been going on for so long. So we've put together a 30-point housing plan that outlines a strategy to improve housing affordability across BC for all kinds of people who need housing that they can afford.
Okay, well, thank you for that overview. So the budget emphasizes empowering local governments to build and retain affordable housing and to build their capacity to respond to housing needs that arise. Could you tell us what that actually means?
Yeah, I can. So we need to keep in mind that, it's partners that come together to build housing, right? Governments technically don't build housing. Often it's the private sector. Sometimes it is government for certain kinds of housing. And local governments really do the land use planning. They're on the ground. They make the decisions about how the land that we have, the land that they have, and how it's going to be used. So we really wanted to make sure that they had the tools that they need to make the right decisions for their communities. The other thing that was really interesting for me as a new minister, when I was sworn in July, one of the very first sort of big events that I did was the UBCM, which is the Union of BC Municipalities, because our Premier in his wisdom put together local government, housing, and TransLink all under one ministry, recognizing that there's an interface between these three different areas that really all impact housing. And when I was at the UBCM, I had 62 meetings in 5 days with different local governments from around the province. And what became clear to me was the housing crisis is playing out differently in different communities. And so what I've heard from local governments was that they needed some tools, and so there's two specific ones that we talk about in this budget that we're going to be acting on. And one is that local governments do a needs assessment of their unique housing needs.
Right.
So we heard in some communities that what they need is really housing for seniors, downsize housing. And that was in smaller communities in the interior, for example. But in other communities, like in Prince Rupert, they have some of the oldest housing stock in the province. So they need housing for families. And then, of course, you come to the Lower Mainland, and it's very, very different in terms of we need rental housing. So we wanted to ask local governments and have local governments do a needs assessment every 5 years so that we understand how our housing needs change over time and that we can intervene accordingly. So I don't ever want to have BC in this place ever again. And so we want to make sure that we have accurate information.
Okay, so you mentioned two tools and you listed one, the needs assessment. What's the second?
The second one is rental zoning. So right now, local governments can't zone for rental only. They can zone for a commercial or residential, but they can't zone for tenure. And we certainly have been hearing, and we know that there's a real lack of a rental zoning. Or a rental accommodation, rental housing. And so one of the things that we're going to be doing is delivering on making sure that they have the tool available to them so they can use it if it makes sense in their community. And the effect this will have is it will limit speculation, and it will help manage some of the land, the rising costs of land. So when you zone for rental, then you're not competing with people who want to build condos, for example.
Right.
So I'm a renter living in Vancouver, and in fact everyone in this room is. Could you give us some concrete examples of how the province's housing plan will directly affect my living situation right now?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So there's three areas that we're focusing on in this 30-point plan. One is about dealing with the demand and addressing the speculation and all those loopholes that were driving up costs. So that's a chunk of the 30 points. I think it's 13 of the 30 points deal with that. And then we've put in a number of things to address supply, making sure that we're getting the right supply in the right community. And then there's this other section that looks at making sure that we have security for renters. And so we've put together a number of points to make sure that renters like you and everyone in your studio have the opportunity to benefit. So one of them is to expand and increase the benefit for seniors who are living independently. So that's the safer benefit. What was happening was seniors on fixed income get some supplements to help them, and what was happening was rents were spiraling out of control, and they weren't able to keep up and making decisions to maybe forego their medication in order to make rent. So we're increasing that. We're also expanding and increase the rental assistance program. That's for to help working parents. So it's a family supplement for those who are really struggling, so they can feed their kids fresh fruits and vegetables instead of having to just put it all to rent. So we're giving them some support, and we're also expanding the ability for them to apply for it. So we're changing the limit for before it used to be 35,000 was what you had to be, that was the maximum you could be making, and now we've expanded it to 40,000. There's two other places where we're looking at providing security for renters, and that's strengthening protection for renters of manufactured homes. They were under particular threat around speculation for land, and so people living in manufactured home parks were being compromised. And also making sure that we have some extending the life and quality of existing affordable housing. We also want to make sure that we're doing some work around renovation and eviction legislation, because we know that, and we've certainly heard stories of landlords who, while we all acknowledge that they need to make necessary repairs and upgrades to existing rental stock, we also know that there were many who were not really doing significant enough renovations, and we're evicting people as a way to increase rent significantly. So that's a piece of legislation that we're working on to give renters greater protection in cases where there's renovations and demolitions, so that there will be better supports for renters where they actually, in fact, are doing a major repair, but also introducing greater consequences for landlords who misuse these provisions, because we need to make sure that they are completely dissuaded from doing that.
Right. So that's interesting. We wanted to dig a bit more into the language used in the budget. So you talk about security for renters, and that's how it's phrased in the budget, versus the section says security for renters versus affordability for renters, for example. And in the introduction to the budget, you say home prices didn't spike overnight and our housing problem can't be fixed with a single budget. But the fact is we are in a housing crisis, and that word is used with purpose. So you've outlined some ways of tackling this crisis, but it seems like the tone is more one that this is a problem that can only be solved over a period of time. But there are critics who say there are things you could do right now to make things better and more affordable for renters. What would you say to that criticism?
Well, I think it's really important that if we want to make sure that it's more affordable for renters, then we need to make sure that there's supply, right? Because if we don't have enough rental stock, then it becomes sort of frozen, and that's what's happened. It's like things are just frozen, and nobody can move because there's zero vacancy rates.
But in the immediacy right now, like as a renter, what can be done to make my living situation affordable? Like, have you guys thought about, I know this has been brought up by the Vancouver Tenants Union, but putting a rent freeze in place at least temporarily until more solutions can be arrived at?
So we've actually taken some significant steps back in the fall. So we addressed the fixed term lease loophole. We closed the loophole that allowed landlords to bypass rent control and impose unfair rent increases. We also eliminated the geographic rent increase clause, and we increased funding to reduce wait times for tenancy disputes, because it had been allowed to just grow and grow and grow, and so we wanted to make sure that we can address those as well. The challenge that we have is we also need to stimulate more supply and make sure that we have more purpose-built rental being built, and make sure that it is actually affordable. So, rent control and the rent control formula is something that I've asked staff to look at. We're going to be doing some consultations in the coming months, but we need to make sure that we're also not going to bite off our nose to spite our face. If we can't get more supply, then that's not good either, because we have a near zero vacancy rate in the Lower Mainland for sure, and that's really bad for renters. So we need to stimulate supply, and we're certainly looking at some creative ways to do gentle infill and working with local governments so that we can make sure that we're capitalizing on as much opportunity for affordable housing. The other thing that we're doing that I think is really important to consider is what we're doing with student housing, because when I think about where is our affordable or historical affordable housing, I mean, I remember being a student at UBC and then at SFU, and and you got a basement suite, right? It was the affordable housing, but also a lot of my friends got places on campus. And the old government refused to allow universities to build student housing. Right. And we're changing that. We're fixing that and making sure that universities can build student housing. So all together with all of the resources that we're bringing together and all of the grants and post-secondary self-financing and all the partnerships that we're looking at, we know that we can create 8,000 additional student beds. And if you think about where students are living in the affordable housing stock, like the basement suites and like some of the 3-story, 4-story walk-ups that are in parts of town, that if we can get students onto campus, then that will free up a lot of that affordable housing stock and create some of that vacancy. So we're tackling this from many different sides. It's a pretty big thing, but we're coming at it from many different ways to create some vacancy that will alleviate some of the pressure that you and others are feeling.
Right. So it sounds like you're taking a pulse from a lot of different groups in Vancouver in terms of their housing needs. So we're wondering what kind of pressures the NDP has faced from landlords' rights groups like Landlord BC and housing development companies, and how those pressures are reflected in this budget.
I think what we're doing is taking a very thoughtful approach and a very balanced approach. So there's no one group that has a louder voice than any other. All the voices are valuable and help inform us about how we need to, make sure that we're protecting people, as well as stimulating new opportunities. And that's a balance. I'm not, it is a balance. But we need to make sure that we don't swing to one side and shut out another group. And so making sure that we are addressing all of those pieces is really important, because as soon as we let one of those things slip, it actually can have the opposite effect of what we're trying to do. And so we're looking at all of these components and trying to and committed to making sure that we can protect renters, but also we know that at the end of the day, if we can have a healthy vacancy rate, 3% vacancy rate, it will relieve the pressure everywhere.
Right. And then just a brief clarifying question from earlier, quickly. So a temporary rental freeze until rental stock is increased, that's not an option that's going to be pursued by the NDP anytime soon?
Well, right now we know that what we have to do is we have to balance all of these competing needs, and we know that we need to make sure that we have more supply. I think everybody agrees. It has to be the right supply. I'm not talking supply for the sake of supply. It has to be rental supply is what we need, and making sure that local governments have the tools to make that happen is really important, and that's going to take time to deliver. One of the things that I think is really important, and we're prepared to look at all of these things, and we're putting together sort of a consultation plan. It's work that we're going to be doing in the next couple of months, putting together a plan to take a look and talk about what else do renters need in the province. And making sure that we're taking a provincial look at this, not just a Lower Mainland look, because I think it's important to recognize that as a provincial government, we're responsible for renters, the 1.5 million renters right across the province. So while the pressures are significant here, I was surprised to learn how significant they are in other parts of the province.
Sure.
So we need to make sure that we're talking to everybody around the province, and so that's some work that we're going to do later this spring and into the summer.
Okay, but in terms of a temporary rental freeze, the answer is no for Vancouver for now?
Well, we can't do a rental freeze in Vancouver. It's not how the province sort of looks. We can't limit it because it's a provincial scope. But it's one of the provisions that I've asked staff to look at is rent control and the rent control formula. So that is on the table for ongoing research and discussion.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Welcome back. You're listening to CITR 101.9 FM. We're broadcasting to you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam people. That was an exclusive interview with NDP Housing Minister Selena Robinson. I'm Alamdi Alanian. We are currently joined by Sydney Ball, who will be offering a response to the minister's words. Sydney is a steering committee member of the Vancouver Tenants Union, the VTU, a Vancouver advocacy and educational group fighting for the rights of renters living in Vancouver.
I'm Alex DeBoer. On February 21st, Sydney published a response to the 2018 BC budget on the Vancouver Tenants Union website, which served to critique how the budget will affect renters. Full disclosure, Sydney is also the social media manager here at CITR. Just letting everyone know. So thank you so much for joining us, Sydney.
It was a long walk over from my office.
Yeah. Thank you for making the long trek. Before we get started, just in case people are just tuning in now, a bit of a summary is that the minister's response to Democracy Watch's main question about what the provincial government is doing in this budget for the immediate improvement of affordability for renters. The minister's response was that the provincial government has taken significant steps back in the fall in 4 ways. 1, to address fixed-term lease loopholes. 2, they closed loopholes to bypass rent control and impose unfair rent increases. 3, they eliminated a geographic rent increase clause. And 4, they increased funding to reduce time for tenancy disputes. So that was basically her response. So let's get started with our questions. Do you want to start, Olamide?
Yeah, for sure. So Sydney, the minister in that interview spoke a lot about how housing isn't built by government, rather it's built by a group of partners. I think we can take that to mean like different parts of government, and I guess also just like stakeholders as well. I think the interview left me with a sense of confusion about what the provincial level of government is responsible for when it comes to housing in Metro Vancouver and what the municipal government is responsible for. So like as a member of the VTU, the Vancouver Tenants Union, how do you kind of like rationalize these responsibilities? How do you divide these roles that the provincial government has?
The provincial government with the budget really is in charge of a lot of tax revenue, so setting property taxes and that kind of thing. And with that, what they're actually able to do with increased revenue would be to do a mass expansion of building BC housing, which is what we definitely need. Acknowledging that renters are in a crisis right now is also, I think, acknowledging that homelessness is not just caused by other effects like addiction issues and mental health issues. It's actually in part caused by this rental crisis. And if we're facing a less than 1% vacancy rate, then we need mass expansion of social housing building immediately. So that's something that we didn't really see in the budget.
That's interesting, though, because the minister repeatedly emphasizes the need for an increase in housing supply, as you're saying, in order to mitigate housing unaffordability. But you mentioned in your critique on the Vancouver Tenants Union website that increasing housing supply without any reasonable metric of affordability required for new rental development will essentially result in new units coming into the market at exorbitant rates. So can you talk a bit about how having a reasonable metric for affordability changes everything when it comes to building new housing supply?
We've seen like the city of Vancouver talk about what their new metrics of affordability are, and they're like $1,700 for a 1-bedroom.
Right.
And I know most of us aren't making that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the current market, and that's the speculative market setting that rate. That's not based on how much people can afford. And we see this kind of reflected, this kind of way that the province is ignoring what people can afford in the 4% rent increase that's happening this year. So that's 2%, that's inflation, but then it's another 2% on top of that, which is completely arbitrary. So it's a little troublesome to think that they're not accurately defining affordability, or nor that they're paying attention to what exactly actual like welfare and disability rates are, which is a rate that we definitely need for building housing. They also didn't increase welfare or disability rates.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that none of that housing, if it's not built with that specific purpose, those people are not going to be able to afford it.
Right, and in the budget, in their how they lay out this new emphasis on housing supply, they don't specify how much of that will be affordable, right? As far as I understand.
No, they put aside like specific housing for a small amount for Indigenous peoples and
Right.
also for women feeling
yeah.
abuse,
Mhm.
which is good. What they also do is increase what Selena Robertson said is about the Safer for Seniors, that increase, and also the Rental Assistance Program, RAC. But that's going to be entirely eaten up by this 4% rent increase. So I really liked the fact that you kept going back to what the immediate solution is, because if you're going to acknowledge that there's less than 1% vacancy, and if you're also going to acknowledge, which Robinson didn't really acknowledge, is that landlords are consistently abusing the system and people are being turned out of their homes all the times, then you also need to build in better protections, and a rent freeze would be an immediate step that wouldn't cost the taxpayers anything at all.
Cool. Thank you. You talked about landlords abusing the system, right? We're just going to kind of talk about rent evictions, right? So the manager talked about how the provincial government is well aware of rent evictions, and I guess their response is to implement better support for renters and more consequences for landlords that rent evict tenants. In your critique that you wrote that this sends a message that penalties around rent evictions are just a cost of doing business with landlords. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
So right now we're not really seeing any penalties holding up landlords doing this at all, and that's because they can gain such a significant amount by forcing tenants out. So instead what we're usually seeing is that people are scared to mention that their buildings are falling into disrepair because they're scared of being evicted. We also see landlords that issue evictions constantly without actually having the proper permits in place at all. If people don't know often that they can dispute those, but it also means that the burden of disputing those is always on the tenants, which is a giant stress. Like, those are the people that are worried about being turned out into the street and not be able to find another home, and they have to set the hearing with the RTB and do all the work. So it's a situation where it could be completely turned around, where putting more funding into the RTB, I think, is a really, really good idea. But I think you also need to change the structure so that the landlord has to apply for an eviction and has to get a permit for eviction. And what that would do, I think, would be to significantly streamline the process. I think it would cost them less money, and I think we would see a lot less of these costless evictions at the end of the day.
Right. You know, I'm curious when she says, and she did say literally, the provincial government intends to implement better support for renters. I just don't know what that means exactly. Like, she talks a lot about how the role of this budget and the government, the provincial government, is to put in place tools and support for, I suppose, municipal governments and communities to implement changes and address this crisis. But it just seems sort of vague to me. Like, she did list off some, but do you know what she's talking about when she says support for renters? It's just the specific groups, like the seniors having access to supplementary funding, as well as low-income families. I suppose that's what she's referring to.
I mean, I think she's referring to the possibility that municipalities can reassess what areas they would like zoned differently. That seems like a ridiculously long-term solution to somewhere where we already know things that would be able to fix part of the problem. The market and the speculative market has completely, obviously, gotten away from us, and steps do need to be taken to curb that, like, definitely. But in the meantime, what you can do is take away the incentive for landlords to turn people out of their homes. Right now, part of, like, the reason why people get rent evicted at all is because you can up the rent by hundreds of dollars in a month. And so what we would really, really like to push for is actually vacancy control. And what vacancy control is rent control, where the rent is tied to the unit. So landlords will still be able to raise the rent for whatever the allowable amount is once a year. The allowable amount should not be 4% still. But they won't be able to just jack up the rent in between tenants, and that would just take away all of the reason why they do this in the first place. And we really need policy in place that's going to really look at, like, the incentives that landlords have to do this.
Right now the system is sort of responsive versus being proactive on dealing with landlords abusing their tenants. I wanted to talk about the last point in our interview where we really pushed her on the rent freeze thing. And so she ended by saying, eventually, actually answering our question, that the provincial government can't implement a rent freeze just in Metro Vancouver because they deal with the entire province. I was thinking that that wasn't the case because I know the previous provincial government under Christy Clark implemented a speculation tax or a foreign buyers tax only on the geographical area of Metro Vancouver. But if you could talk about that, whether a rent freeze implemented by the provincial government just in Metro Vancouver, the Lower Mainland, is actually legal or possible?
No, that's not possible because the RTB is for all of BC and the allowable.
And what's the RTB?
It's the residential tenancy branch, and the residential tenancy agreement through that lists what the allowable rent increase is, and that's for all of BC. I still don't see why you couldn't issue a rent freeze temporarily for all of BC, considering that we are already in a crisis. That would acknowledge we're in a crisis, and I also definitely don't see why a rent increase would be 2% plus inflation. I don't know anybody whose wage has gone up that amount.
But one thing the minister did assert is that after taking a pulse on the province, different areas in the province have different housing needs. So would it hurt some areas in BC if they implemented a rent freeze on the entire province?
I get the feeling that it's an issue and that rent is an issue everywhere in BC. I don't think I am really pushing for vacancy control throughout BC because what that does is it's preemptive, as you said, and it makes sure that if the market does get out of control, that renters will be protected. Allowing for a temporary rent freeze or for rent increases to just be inflation, I think is just common sense. And anything plus inflation just seems like greed to me and definitely seems like a landlord BC lobbying the government.
Yeah. One thing the minister also talks about, one thing we pushed her on a little bit too, was different lobbying groups that have had an influence on this budget. So we talked a bit about, we mentioned Landlord BC and developers who would be kind of the counterforce to renters in BC and in especially the Metro Vancouver area, what we're specifically talking about. And she mentioned how this budget is very reflective of all these different party interests. Do you think it is sort of like equally aiming to appease everyone, or is it preferencing certain groups?
What I really read this budget as is kind of trying to ease the anxieties of people that want to get into the housing market. We don't come from a place where private ownership is really going to be the answer to making sure that housing is a human right for everybody. I don't think that the goal should really be to make sure that every single person in BC should be able to own a home. I think the goal should make sure that everyone has safe and secure housing. And I think that a budget that's not going to even address homelessness, because it really didn't do anything to specifically address homelessness at all, means that they're not listening to the people that are in crisis, and those should be the people that are prioritized in a budget.
Yeah, it seems like the budget is directed more towards middle class people, middle and upper class people versus, people who are in poverty or experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, the other thing that we're really seeing with this budget is like an increase in the foreign buyers tax, which has had no effect on the market after a year and a half into its implementation. So I don't understand why you would increase that. The speculation tax, we're going to have to wait to see how that one really shakes out because I'm not really quite clear as how it's worded in the budget. It's worded in the budget so there's an exemption automatically for people who own their home or who are renting long term, and that makes sense to me. But there's also tax credit for people that have income tax in BC. So what that means to me, I feel like, is that speculation tax is actually an empty homes tax that's going to target foreign ownership and also ownership throughout the rest of Canada. So people in Alberta that have second homes, and that's good. But that it's not really admitting the part of the problem is also speculation in BC and ownership of multiple properties in BC. And if we're going to treat housing like a human right, then even the people that pay income tax locally shouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah. Great. Well, that's all we have time for. It's 6 p.m. now. Thank you so much for joining us. We have Sydney Ball here in studio with us. She is a steering committee member at the Vancouver Tenants Union. Today is International Women's Day. Stay tuned to CITR for more awesome programming. And join us again on Democracy Watch next week